As they say, I blossomed late, despite the fact that my father, Jack Watson, was 190 centimeters tall, had 110 kilograms of muscles, and was as strong as everyone around. I was a skinny kid. In my early teens, it didn't help me much that my father said that he also developed late, because no one at the school where I went cared about it, and I suffered compared to my nearest neighbor. Will Simpson lived next door, although he was only a year older than me, since he was big and muscular for his age, and I was short and thin. It seemed that there was a difference of 4 or 5 years between us, not one. In retrospect, I think Will had, and probably still has, some kind of mental or personality disorder because he vacillated between being nice and being abusive to me. I could never tell for sure what was waiting for me in the afternoon. If it wasn't a personality disorder or a mental problem, perhaps his erratic actions could be explained by how strange his family was. Will had an older brother, Sam, who was an urban teenage jerk. Obviously, Sam inherited this from Will's father, Mitch, who was an adult jerk in the city. Fortunately, Mitch traveled a lot, so he wasn't seen too often, and Sam seemed to be constantly causing trouble or in jail for various offenses. The only normal member of the Simpson family was Will's mother, Betty. Betty was nice to everyone, but she seemed to take a special interest in me. And if she had been around, she would have done her best to mitigate the harm that Will have caused me. Betty also seemed much more intelligent and sophisticated than the other members of the family, and since I didn't have the physique or coordination for athletics as a teenager, I tried to study hard and get good grades in a variety of subjects. Betty has always been interested in history, literature, civil law, and connection with current events, and even science. So we often talked about these topics. Since both my parents worked, I often went to Betty's house after school. After discussing a topic of mutual interest, she would send me away with homemade cakes, smiling and saying, "Thanks for coming to talk to me, Jeremy. It was so nice." When I became a teenager, I also did home improvement for Betty, for which I was rewarded with a big smile, chase tugs, and another treat of pastries. Will inherited his attractiveness from Betty's. She had a very pretty face, although I never paid much attention to her figure. There was nothing remarkable about her. She was neither thin nor fat, but nothing more could be said about it because she always wore very conservative clothes, whether at home or on the street. I think it's human nature to remember the bad more than the good, at least for me. It had to do with Will's attitude towards me. Will was the starting quarterback for the high school football team when he was a sophomore, and I was a lowly freshman. At Will's insistence, I was the manager, towel carrier of the team for 1 year, but no one else, because of the cruel antics that Will force his teammates to do to me, including sealing my pants with duct tape, applying analgesic balm under my armpits, and sealing my locker. This rude behavior was interspersed with fairly outspoken actions, so I didn't completely separate myself from Will, and there were good times when I was just one of the guys. Being such a skinny, non-athletic teenager, I never really went on dates. I was too shy around girls, the exact opposite of Will's position. He was sociable and dated from time to time the prettiest and sweetest girl in school, Marcia Briggs. Marcia was the cherished dream of every teenager. She looked like Kate Upton before anyone even heard of Kate Upton. I think that says it all. She was the queen of everything at school, not only because she was incredibly beautiful, but also because she was nice to everyone. Of course, I idolized her, but she was so far from being attainable that I never even considered the opportunity to show my worship. I could barely manage a greeting. I was so impressed with her when she came to Will's house and when I was around. However, one thing about Marcia puzzled me. I've never been able to figure out why she put up with Will's constant antics. The most intense emotional pain Will has ever inflicted on me was when I was at my most vulnerable. At the beginning of my freshman year, I was just starting to gain some self-confidence and decided that I finally needed to act because I was in love with Amy Williams, who was in several of my classes. Amy was not someone I considered unattainable, like the goddess Marcia, even if she was more desirable in every way than me. Amy's appearance was probably one of the best among the girls in our school, although she didn't even come close to the girls Will dated when he was dating Marcia again. I made the mistake of telling Will about my crush on Amy. Less than 2 weeks after I foolishly told Will about my crush on Amy, I finally plucked up the courage and asked Amy out on a date. When I was talking to her, mostly stuttering near her locker, Will intervened in our conversation and asked Amy out that weekend. Of course, she couldn't say no to the cute quarterback, and I was left with a flushed face. As they walked away from me, chatting like old friends and ignoring me. Less than a month after that, Will used Amy and then continued to tarnish her reputation at school. Poor Amy couldn't stand it and transferred to another school during the holidays. After the story with Amy, I distanced myself from Will. I had to do it out of self-preservation. Perhaps strangely, the only person I told about this was Will's mom. One day she asked me bluntly why I always disappeared when we showed up and didn't go anywhere with him anymore. Betty was just as upset as I was. She comforted me and even shed tears with me. Then she told me something very surprising, but inspiring. Jeremy, although I love my husband and the boys, I know they are self-centered jerks, and I apologize for that. Will doesn't deserve a good friend like you. It won't be easy for you and your youth, but one day you will achieve success that will surpass them and any other person in the area. Your intelligence and kind, loving nature will serve you well. Never change. Never become angry or cynical. Then she kissed me on the cheek and hugged me tightly. It lifted my spirits more than anything else in my entire adolescence. After that, any problems I had, I felt more comfortable discussing with Betty than with my own parents. Betty has always been a good listener. She often made good suggestions and always made it clear that she was on my side, no matter what. Physically, I started to change at the beginning of the summer after graduating from the first grade of high school. I was 17. I first noticed this when things that had always been difficult for me to handle before began to come much easier to me. Then my shoes didn't fit. Then my trousers turned out to be too short. Then the collar of my only shirt turned out to be too tight. And if I were a singer, my voice would become deeper from tenor to baritone. By the end of the summer, I was of average height and weight, no longer short and skinny. I continued to change dramatically throughout my senior year, so that about 2 months before graduation, I was 185 centimeters tall, weighed 100 kilograms, and had almost no fat. When I noticed that my muscles were starting to develop, for the first time I really devoted time, an effort to improving my body, although due to my lack of athletic experience, I did not practice any team sports. Strength training classes had just started at my school as an alternative to the gym. So I took this course and became almost addicted to training. It's easy when you see progress. While both Mom and Dad spoke approvingly of my radically changed appearance, Betty's characterization was the most flattering. Your body is now as amazing as your mind and character, she exclaimed enthusiastically several times with a big smile on her face. Around the time my physical metamorphosis was almost complete, 2 tragedies occurred in the neighborhood. Betty's eldest son, Sam, committed a criminal offense and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Then, about a month later, her husband Mitch died in a car accident in another state. What was only able to come home from college for the funeral and a few days after that, which once again demonstrated how self-centered he was. Betty had no other relatives in the immediate vicinity. Therefore, shortly before my 18th birthday, I became her main confidant and emotional support. Betty did not force me to work as a confidant and emotional support. I was just always available to her, including visiting her every day after school. She admitted that she could no longer afford to maintain the house she lived in and, having no family nearby, wanted to prepare it for sale. In the summer after graduating from high school, my life began to improve. I physically became what I wanted to be. I was ready to go to a good public school with a 3-time academic scholarship, and I had an easy, if unusually well-paid job for the summer. A few days after I turned 18, my parents threw the only party they've thrown in my honor since I turned 11, my graduation and my 18th birthday at the same time. All my relatives were invited, several friends, including several new ones, as I have matured physically and several neighbors. Of course, Betty was among them. Well, wasn't going to come home for the summer, but instead went to summer school to keep this right to play football. And I had already promised Betty that I would help her prepare the house for sale, so she didn't need his help with that. I didn't open the presents during the party, but I did it the next day. Betty told me that she would like me to come to her house a day or two after the party, and she would give me a special gift when I came to her house after my summer job. 2 days after the party, she greeted me cheerfully. I remember thinking that I was really happy that she had recovered from her illness after the death of her husband and after the eldest son was sent to prison. It was probably the first time I looked at her as a woman and not as a friend's mother. Since her husband died, she began to dress less conservatively and insisted that I call her Betty and not Mrs. Simpson. By the time of the party, I was already used to being treated like that. Hi, Betty, is this a good time for me to come by your place? You made me think about my supposedly special gift. I greeted her with a big smile on my face as she opened the front door. Then I instinctively, without thinking about it at all, said, "This dress suits you very well." Thanks, Jeremy. Betty smiled back. I really hope that you will like my gifts. I noticed the plural and the word gifts, but then I didn't pay attention to it. Betty poured me a glass of juice and ice, tea for herself, and we sat down at the kitchen table. This is a postcard and your first gift, she said after I took my first sip of juice, handing me a small bag and an envelope. I took off the wrapping paper and found Stephen Vicency's original hardcover book, For the Glory of Older Women, signed by the author. I heard about this book in literature class in my second year, but I've never read it. Betty and I have discussed modern literature many times, but we have never discussed this book. How did you manage to get the author's autograph? I asked, looking into Betty's eyes. I noticed that she was blushing. I have a friend who works in a large publishing house, and she was able to get the original edition of the book and get Mr. Vicency's autograph through her channels. I hope this is a good gift, she replied. She seemed to blush even more. I've heard about this book, and I'm sure I'll like it, I replied with a grin. I noticed that she looked away. You should open the postcard right now, she said softly. Okay, I replied, opening the envelope. On the outside of the postcard was printed a message about graduation and about the 18th anniversary. She might have been hard to find, but she certainly wasn't weird or even unusual. However, I was not prepared for what was handwritten inside. Jeremy, you are my dearest person, not from my family, on earth. There are no words to describe how much your communication has meant to me over the years and the tenderness you have shown in the last 2 very difficult months. I think the best way I can express my gratitude to you is if I make sure that you don't go to college as a virgin. Love, Betty. I swallowed hard, and then raised my head and looked at Betty. She was all red, but she met my gaze with a determined expression on her face. Like any normal 18-year-old teenager, I've seen a lot of women on the internet. However, due to my shyness and lack of a real personal life, I have never seen any of them in person. Her crotch was shiny and almost hairless except for what I was told in internet articles was a landing strip. Her labia looked much bigger and more attractive than I saw on the screen, and I unmistakably identified a musky smell that is not felt on a computer monitor. I was absolutely blown away by how feminine she was. I'm sure my eyes got as big as saucers when the thought flashed through my brain. Wow, Betty really looks beautiful. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. Fortunately, despite her obvious embarrassment, Betty did move. I'd love that, Betty. I murmured and kissed her again. It's been the best day of my life so far. She interrupted me with a sly smile. The best is yet to come. And so it was. It was by far the best summer of my life. Betty and I didn't just make love. We went to the movies, to the plays, went canoeing into the park together, or in different cars, so as not to allow suspicion about our relationship or under the pretext that we need to do something to help sell the house. My parents, busy with their lives and the lives of my younger sisters, never asked me questions. 2 or 3 days a week, I visited Betty after work. On the days when I didn't come to her after work, I used the key she gave me and sneaked into her house in the middle of the night, raped my lover a couple of times, and then returned home not just satisfied, but euphoric. Despite our constant contacts, due to circumstances, we never had the opportunity to spend the night together until she sold her house shortly before I had to leave for college. I helped her move into an apartment in the city where she had a family more than 300 kilometers away. Before the 3 nights we spent together in her new apartment, Betty made it clear what the future held for us. Jeremy, I love you and I know that you love me. However, I'm 26 years older than you, and you need a girl who matches your age. Besides, I need to move on with my life, and even though I'm already old by your standards, I have something to offer a man. I need to find someone who is right for my age. Therefore, when you leave here on Saturday, we will never be together in bed again. She gave her little speech, which, as I could see, was not easy for her with tears in her eyes. I knew she was right, but it still hurt my heart. I don't think I'll ever find someone I'm as compatible with as I am with you, I replied, tears welling up in my eyes. How sweet of you to say that, she smiled, stroking my cheek. I sincerely hope that you will do it, but we are good together, aren't we? She laughed. In my opinion, this was an understatement of the decade. After Betty's little speech and my response, she wiped her tears and mine. It was the first time she used the word making love in her relationship with me. However, it opened the floodgates, and for the next 3 days we both talked obscenities, using each other to oblivion 3 times a day, when combined with me caressing her or inserting a vibrator into her ass. It felt like we were making love for at least 10 hours a day. When we finally went to bed to recharge rather than make love, we passed out rather than fell asleep. Betty and I thanked each other warmly, kissed goodbye, and promised to email each other regularly. By the time I returned home after that trip, I was ready to go to college, knowing that I could stand up for myself in any situation. As Betty predicted, I really succeeded in life because I was smart, hardworking, and kind to everyone unless they demonstrated that they were unworthy of my kindness. By the time I turned 28, I had my own company with headquarters in the city where I grew up. For fun and to stay fit yourself, I did cross-training for runners at the local fitness center twice a week in the evening and on Saturday mornings, and I had a good group of friends. The only area where my life has not been successful has been long-term relationships with women. Although, since my sophomore year of college, I have had several relationships that lasted about 6 months or longer. I have never found anyone with whom I would be fully compatible. I have never consciously blamed Betty for this, but I am sure that deep down I compared my friends with Betty, and they did not meet my expectations. Betty and I communicated by email for 3 years until she found a guy who was crazy about her and who was much nicer than her ex-husband Mitch. She decided it was better to stop our communication. I agreed with her then, so we didn't talk anymore, although I always try to be nice and attentive with my friends. In the end, I convinced myself that the current girl was not suitable for me and ended the relationship as gently as possible. When, at the age of 28, I broke up with a woman whom the rest of the world thought was perfect for me, I finally admitted to myself that I needed help and went to a therapist. After 2 sessions with a therapist, something happened that changed my life. I was just shopping at a grocery store that I rarely visited, but which was not far from my house when I heard, "Jeremy? Jeremy Watson, is that you?" I turned around and saw what seemed to me to be a balding version of Will Simpson with a beer belly. First of all, I recognized him by the self-confident grin on his face, which I had often seen before. "Hi, Will," I replied as soon as I was sure it was him. "I didn't know you lived nearby." "Yes, my wife and I have been living next door for about 3 years. How are you? I see that you are definitely not a skinny kid anymore," he replied. Of course, I was no longer a skinny kid when he last saw me 10 years ago, but that was only once. And I'm sure in his mind I was still a 95-pound weakling who lived next door, and not someone 195 centimeters tall and weighing 110 kilograms with bulging calf and arm muscles. I was surprised at how friendly Will was to me. Obviously, he had forgotten the incident with Amy, but he had caused so much suffering to so many people in the past that it probably wasn't in his memory anymore. He even invited me to a party at his house next weekend. I was looking for a subtle way to refuse, and was figuring out which grocery store I should visit in the future so that I wouldn't run into him anymore when he said, Marcia would be happy to invite one of our old school friends. Maybe he's referring to Marcia Briggs. It flashed through my mind when I remembered the clone of Kate Upton, who was his girlfriend in high school and the woman of my dreams. Are you and Marcia Briggs married? I asked, trying to hide the disbelief in my voice, because I always assumed that a beautiful and adventurous girl like Marcia would eventually realize what an ass Will was and distance herself from him. Of course, she made an honest man out of me shortly after graduating from college. Will grinned. I was suddenly curious. I wondered if the girl who was so amazing had changed, that I hadn't even imagined that she would be dating someone like me. I wondered if she was still the sweetest other than Betty woman I'd ever seen, or if she'd become an absent-minded witch after being married to Will for 5 or 6 years. So I happily replied, Of course. Well, that's very nice of you. When is the party and what is the address? The following Saturday night, I showed up at Will and Marcia's house with a bottle of expensive Cabernet, dressed to the nines. With some vanity that embarrassed me, I made sure that my biceps were clearly visible under the tight-fitting shirt I was wearing. Marcia Simpson, neighboring, opened the door. Hi, she said with a puzzled expression on her face. She obviously didn't recognize me. Hi, I'm Jeremy Watson, I replied with a smile. I was Will's next-door neighbor when I was a kid, and I ran into him last weekend at Kroger's on Jackson Street, and he invited me to your party. I hope I'm not interrupting. Jeremy? Are you kidding me? There was skepticism in her voice. Well, told me he invited you, but I really don't recognize you. Yes, I laughed. The last time you saw me, I was probably 1 meter 70, and I weighed 50 kilograms. I had a growth spurt. I see. She grinned. Well, come in. Welcome. I handed her a bottle of Cabernet, for which she thanked me warmly. I think she was sophisticated enough to realize that the wine was probably worth the $80 I paid for it. She still seemed to have some doubts about who I was when she introduced me to the other partygoers. This went on until we came running from the backyard, holding a plastic cup filled with beer in his hand, slapped me on the back and said, It's good that you came, Jeremy. You remember Jeremy, don't you? Marcia, the skinny boy next door. I'm not sure what made me do it, but I laughed, maybe I grinned. I'm not sure. And then I picked Will up in my arms, spun him around and said, Not skinny anymore. I wanted Will to know that I wouldn't listen to him say nasty things, even if it was his party. Fortunately, for the peace of the evening, Will laughed it off, despite the fact that due to my actions, a small amount of beer spilled on his shirt, having bought myself a symbolic mug of beer, which I intended to drink. All evening, since I don't really drink alcohol, I mingled with the guests, all the while trying to watch Marcia out of the corner of my eye. Her face was almost as beautiful as I remembered it. She may have gained a few pounds, which was noticeable, but she was definitely a beautiful woman. However, I couldn't say anything about her figure, because oddly enough, her clothes were very conservative. She was wearing trousers, a long-sleeved blouse that was not tucked in, and flat shoes. I got the impression that of the 25 or so guests, about 2/3 were married, and another third were single, both men and women. Most of them, despite being in their late 20s or early 30s, seemed to want to get drunk, which I thought they had given up after college. In accordance with my plan to find out what Marcia was like, I took every opportunity to communicate with her unnoticed. I think I made a big impression on her when I was the only person who offered to help with the preparation of some of the dishes that she cooked and served on the table, and worked with her alone in the kitchen for a good 20 minutes, preparing everything necessary. I did not fail to praise her culinary delights, which were actually quite delicious, and received a big smile from her in response. I spent most of the evening talking to Marcia more than anyone else. She still seemed as sweet as she had in high school, while was noisy and obnoxious most of the time, even more than in high school. At some point, Will decided that one of the guys needed to play poker, despite Marcia's protests, and he and a group of his drunken friends went to the back porch, where there was a gaming table, and began dealing cards. One of the players passed out shortly after the start of the game, which is why Will came to the living room, where the rest of the guests were gathered, and insisted that I take his place. At first, I resisted, but seeing that he was constantly becoming more obnoxious, and the anxiety that this caused Marcia, I gave in. Since I was completely sober and played poker well, and the others, especially Will, were drunk and probably not that good. Even if they were sober, it wasn't long before I climbed to the top. Will continued to raise the stakes, including emptying his wallet, while the rest of the players at the table were eliminated. It's just him and me. I tried to cash out the money. I even offered to return it to everyone, lying that I was a card sheet, but to no avail. Since all the guests except the unconscious ones had left by then, Marcia entered the room and tried to persuade Will to disperse. Instead, he went all in during Texas Hold'em, when there were 2, 4, 5, 6, and a queen of all suits on the board, at least one card of each suit, and I had a 7 and an 8 in my hands. In other words, I couldn't lose. I tried to persuade him not to go all in, because the more than 6 liters of beer he drank clouded his mind, but he just thought that I had a losing combination. So I reluctantly let him. Will had 2 ladies on his hands. But of course a 3 can't beat a straight. So I started collecting all the money on the table. And Marcia sighed in the background. "Let's play everything you've won again." Will growled and then belched. "Will, you're out of money?" I said as pleasantly as I could. "Look, if I lose, you can use Marcia." "I know that's what you've always wanted. Ever since high school," he blurted out. Marcia began to cry. For some reason, I remembered the incident with Amy in high school, and I was furious. "How dare you think you can use your wife as a poker chip? You pompous ass!" I shouted. "You obviously don't deserve her, and you need to apologize to her right now." "Fuck you," Will roared, standing up, and Marcia visibly cringed with wide eyes. "Now accept my offer and take another hand, or I'll slap you on the back of the head." "This boat sailed 10 years ago, asshole," I shouted back, also standing up. The drunk jerk took 2 steps towards me and then swung. I easily deflected his pathetic attempt, hit him once in the beer belly with all my strength, and when he bent over, speechless, I hit him with an uppercut in the chin. After he hit the floor, he almost lost consciousness and vomited. I was afraid, just because I didn't want any legal complications, that he would suffocate. So I shouted to Marcia to bring kitchen towels. I sat him down, trying my best not to throw up, and slapped him hard on the back several times. Marcia soon returned with what I asked for, and together we used kitchen towels to wipe the vomit from his mouth, and I supported him in an upright position. When we finished, I was still not sure that Will's life was in danger because he continued to choke, and as soon as Marcia was alone with him, I realized that she alone could not cope with his weight. He weighed 130 kilograms, which is 50 more than his normal weight. So I convinced Marcia to call 911 and help the paramedics put Will on a stretcher. When Marcia got into the ambulance with Will, I told her that I would clean up the house. I gave her my mobile phone number so that she would call if she needed a ride from the hospital, no matter what time it is. Marcia, she looked at me with wide eyes, then said, "Thank you," and the ambulance door closed. I did as I promised. Not only did I clean up the vomit after him, a very unpleasant task, but I worked in college, so I knew what to do. But I also cleaned up everything that was left after the party. I loaded the dishes in the dishwasher twice, washed the dishes by hand, cleaned the whole house, and called a taxi for 3 drunks when they woke up before Marcia called. It was 3:30 in the morning. "Hi, Jeremy." "Hi, Marcia. I'm glad you called. Do you need a ride?" "Well, yes, if it doesn't cause you too much trouble. They left Will overnight because they think he has alcohol poisoning. He has drunk some strong drinks in addition to a quarter of a keg of beer and is not very responsive. Besides, when he hit his head on the floor, he could have had a concussion. So they're afraid to leave him unattended, Marcia replied, clearly exhausted. Good. Are you at the hospital on the corner of 23rd and Chambers? Yes. I'll see you at the ambulance. Exit in 15 minutes. When I picked up Marcia, she looked tired, but to my surprise, she also put on new makeup. We were silent most of the time until we got to her house. She thanked me and then said, I need your help with something. Could you come in for a second? Of course, I replied. When we entered her house and she saw that everything was cleaned up, she was shocked. I can't believe you did all this. My house has never looked so good. Why did you do that? I promised that I would help clean up and I got carried away. Besides, I thought that after the night you had, when your husband disrespected you. And then I got carried away and hurt him, and you had to go to the hospital, could use a break. I replied. Marcia stood and stared at me for a good 30 seconds. I feel guilty for asking you to do something else after everything you've done. But could you help me load the barrel and related supplies from the backyard into Will's pickup truck? Of course, I replied. I can handle it alone. Why don't you relax? All right, she replied, but don't leave until you answer a few questions for me. This statement confused me, but I smiled back and went out into the backyard. I took the tap off the barrel, poured the melting ice out of the large container in which the barrel was located, and then took the barrel, pallet, and pipe faucet and turned to the garage, loaded them into a pickup truck and strapped them in. When I returned to the living room, Marcia was dressed differently. Daisy Duke shorts, short sleeve top, bare belly, and 8 centimeters heels. The mystery of the figure has now been solved. She looked as good as she did in high school, and maybe better as she grew up. I hope my eyes hadn't deceived me. Thanks again. Jeremy, she said in a seductive voice, before you leave, please answer me a few questions honestly. Before I could answer, she asked me the first question. Do you have a girlfriend? No, not now, I muttered, still admiring her looks. Do you remember Betty, Will's mother? What the hell is this getting at? I asked myself. Oh, yes, of course, I remember her. A wonderful woman. Why would she say you're the best guy in the world? Marcia asked, putting her hands on her hips and putting on a playfully stern expression. Well, when did you talk to her? I stammered. Tonight, when Will was in the hospital. I wanted to inform her about the situation and also ask her what she remembers about you. Oh, was my intelligent reply with clearly frog-like eyes. Well, Betty and I have always liked each other. When I was a teenager, she was probably my best friend. She liked you better than Will. Didn't she? Maybe if she said so. Have you wanted to use me since high school? Marcia, I don't think that's an appropriate question. I replied after a meaningful pause, confident that I was turning bright red. Under the right circumstances, she barked rather than asked, still with the same playfully stern expression on her face. Yes, probably under certain circumstances. I stammered, embarrassed. For example, if I hadn't been married to Will. Yes, I think so. Marcia broke into a big smile, went to the front door, opened it and said, thanks for coming. For all your help and for being honest with me, she chuckled. As I was walking out the door, she pulled on my shirt so that our lips were on the same level, kissed me on the lips for a long 5-second kiss. And while she was doing this, ran her hand over my trousers in the crotch, which was obviously stretched. Then she playfully pushed me out and closed the door. I heard the lock click. What the hell was that? I asked myself a million times during the short trip home. For a good 2 weeks. It was difficult for me to focus on anything other than the image of Marcia and Daisy Duke. Shorts and a revealing top, her kiss and touching my crotch when I left. Sometimes I fantasized about using it to the point of insanity in front of a bound Will, and then posting photos of me doing it all over the internet to ruin the reputation of both of them. That would be a change of position. After the incident with Amy, wouldn't it? I laughed to myself. However, much more often than in this fantasy, I ran into Marcia at a conference outside the city, and we used each other to the point of unconsciousness, just as Betty and I had done for the last 3 days of our relationship. However, after 2 more sessions with the psychoanalyst, I finally pulled myself together again and really went on a couple of boring dates, trying not to compare them with Marcia. I even had a one-night stand with a woman I picked up in a bar, a very slutty, less gifted, and attractive version of Marcia. About 3 months after the party at Will's house, I had just returned from a Saturday morning cross-training class, showered, put on a t-shirt, loose shorts, and ate a couple handfuls of nuts. I was deciding what to eat for a late lunch when there was a knock on the door. I opened it and saw Marcia standing on the threshold in a dress that seemed vaguely familiar to me. "Hi, Jeremy. Are you surprised to see me?" She chuckled. "Yes, you could say that," I replied. Marcia looked radiant. "Are you going to invite me in?" "What is it?" she asked modestly. "Of course. Where are my manners?" I replied, throwing the door wide open. Marcia came in with a large envelope in her hands, commented on how beautiful my house looked, and then asked, "Can we go to your kitchen table so I can show you what's in this envelope?" "Ah, of course," I stammered. "But first, do you have a copy of the book For the Glory of Older Women?" Of course. I had a book that Betty gave me for my 18th birthday and graduation. I kept it in a place of honor on my bookshelf. But why the hell did she ask me that? It's a strange question. But yes, there is. "Can I see it?" "What is it?" she asked with a twinkle in her eyes. Of course you can," I said. I went into my office, took a book off the shelf, and handed it to Marcia. She opened it, looked at the signature and thanks from author Stephen Vicensey, grinned, and then carefully put the book on the table. Then she opened the envelope she was holding in her hands. "This is a copy of my separation agreement with Will. I've already filed for divorce. I made it clear that if he challenged this or my proposed 50-50 asset split, I would make public his infidelities and questionable transactions at the company he works for. I don't foresee any problems." I quickly looked through the papers, and they turned out to be as she said. Why did you want me to see them?" I asked. "Because when Betty gave me this dress, she said that you would never have used me if I was still with Will, that I would have missed out on the best love making of my life with the best guy in the world. That's why," she said with a grin. "This dress was on Betty the day we made love for the first time," flashed through my foggy mind. As soon as Marcia and I came to our senses, I picked her up and turned her to face me. I said sadly, "I'm sorry I got so carried away," I muttered. "But you have such an amazing body that—" I couldn't help myself. All we did was make love, take a shower, and eat. We slept for 2 hours. No more until the next morning. At 8 a.m., she took out her cell phone, dialed a number, and said, "Hi, it's me. Do you want to talk to him?" Marcia handed me the phone with a big smile and said, "It's for you." I was puzzled when I said, "Hi, this is Jeremy." "Hi, Jeremy, this is Betty." Kim's sing-sung voice on the other end of the line. "My Betty," I asked involuntarily. "I'm not yours anymore. I'm Thomas's Betty now," she giggled. "Nevertheless, you know that I still love you." "I'm sure you still love me. And that's why I'm asking you to do me a favor." "Of course." "It's amazing. But you know I'll do anything for you. Betty, give Marcia a chance to have a long-term relationship with you. We'll never treat her properly. And to me, she's like the daughter I never had, especially after her mother died when she was in college. Marcia deserves a wonderful life. Just like you. You deserve to love each other. Please give her a chance to make it happen." I laughed to myself. The only woman I've ever really loved advises me to give the goddess in my bed a chance, because I'm going to love her too. With a mischievous smile on my face, I snorted into the phone. "I'll let you know in a few months, Betty. Right now, someone is trying to resurrect my dead limb, and I have to find out if she can do it." I heard Betty laughing just as I pressed the red button on my phone. Amazingly, Marcia woke me up again that morning. We made great love. 2 weeks later, she moved in with me. And 2 weeks after her divorce from Will, we got married. Betty was a bridesmaid. That was 3 years ago. I've never been so happy, not even with Betty. Marcia is now 7 months pregnant, but still insists that I serve her almost every day. Will moved out of town after the divorce. The best position change in the world. End.